welcome to another episode of Mine Planning Matters, a podcast where we talk about where the industry gets it both right and wrong when it comes to mine planning and mining engineering. This podcast is not just for mine planners, it's for everyone who has anything to do with mine plans, from those who create them, to those who execute them, and all the way up to those who endorse or sign off on them. My name is Mark Bowater, Director and Founder of Australian mining consultancy Insignia Mining, and I speak from experience, having been involved in mine planning for over 30 years. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Mine Planning Matters. Now in this episode, I want to talk at a high level about production rate assumptions across the breadth of plans, from sort of your execution plans at a weekly level or something like that through to life of mine. Because certainly in my time, I've come across some strange things at mine sites in terms of the numbers that they use in those differing length plans. And I'm going to give an example of a mine site that I was at recently, where, at many mining operations, the key plan is your annual budget, or maybe it's a 2-year budget. But that's the one that there's a lot of work that goes into in terms of what assumptions to use for utilisation, availability and productivity, which ultimately give you your production numbers. There's a lot of work goes into that, a lot of assumptions, a lot of work at a lot of mine sites around haulage constraints and how many trucks are required. And so often that becomes the basis that drives plans. I've seen at a lot of operations that actually drives the input assumptions both up and down in terms of then the numbers that are used in the very short-term plans, and then some sort of continuous improvement basis on that annual plan to turn into the numbers that are used in life of mine plans or 5-year plans. But as I say, I was at this mine site and they do like a 12-week plan, a rolling 12-week plan every week. Which for me, as I've said many times, I think that the 12 to 16-week plan is probably the most important mine plan, because that's the one that you make the key decisions that set you up for success in your execution plan, the weekly plan. And anyway, they were having problems with their 12-week plan, where it really was only lasting a week or two before it was too far out. And that's what I call the shelf life of a mine plan, is how long before it's sort of no longer usable. And so I spoke to them about the production rate assumptions that they were using in that 12-week plan. And basically they were using the assumptions that were built into the 2-year budget that was run at the mine site. And of course that 2-year budget suffered from one of the crimes against mine planning of optimistic input assumptions driven by executives who wanted to see improvement at the mine site and better production rates. And so the numbers that were being used in the 12-week plan were very optimistic relative to recent production. And so, of course, that's why the plan was getting out within, say, 2 weeks. It was sort of too far out to be usable. My argument with them is that a 12-week plan is really about decisions. Where do we drill next? And when should we walk this digger from here to A to B? And so it's really fundamentally important decisions that you are making. And so therefore the 12-week plan should be based on recent historical productivity and utilisation availability assumptions. It should be based closer to actuals than some hypothetical 2-year budget number that's got a whole lot of improvement built into it. And so when I think about what sort of numbers should we be using in our differing plans, if I start at the shortest one, the execution plan, the weekly plan, for example, that should be definitely not based on budget assumptions. It should be based on recent historicals, and I would think that you should be looking at something like the last couple of months typically, say the last month or two, what's production been like in the different areas that you're currently working in, and that's your very recent historical production rates, and that's what you should be using in your weekly plan. That's what you did last week or the week before. That's most likely what you're going to get next week. When you go up to, say, a 12-week or a 16-week, again, your time frame for making improvements, because this is what it sort of comes back to some extent, is that in an annual budget or in a 2-year budget, you're assuming that you're going to make certain improvements. You've got certain initiatives, continuous improvement initiatives in place, and that's the justification for using rates that are higher than what you're currently achieving. But certainly in a 1-week time frame, you're not going to make any improvements. And I would argue that in a 12-week time frame or 16-week time frame, the amount of improvement that you're going to make from various improvement initiatives is not that high. And so I would think that in a 12 to 16-week plan, you should be using something like an historical sort of 6-month to 12-month averages. What have you got for the last 6 months or so on average? That's likely what you're going to get for the next 12 to 16 weeks. Maybe there's a very slight improvement built in, but only if you have an initiative in place that is going to achieve a certain, improvement in utilization via a reduction of operating delays, or you have some plan in place for increasing the productivities. If there's some initiative in place, then you might bake some improvement from your 6-month historical numbers into 12 to 16 week. But other than that, I would argue that this is a key plan to be right, and so therefore you should be using your historicals. Then you get your annual budget or your 2-year budget, and again, like I say, a lot of operations that's had a lot of work built into it, and the assumptions are sort of fairly fixed and driven in that one. But if we then go past that and we go to the 5-year or life of mine, I think it gets reasonable to look at your long-term productivity, historical production rates for equipment, and see, is there an improvement trend over the last 5 years, 10 years, for example. I would be looking at long-term trends. And, if you're seeing that your digger annual production over the last 10 years is on a long-term trend of improving by 1 or 2% or something like that, then I think that's fine to build that into your life of mine plans, your long-term plans. But again, then with a note of caution in that you have to always be familiar of what you might call the structural capacity of the machine or something like that, which is, a digger can only swing at a certain rate, can only load a truck at a certain rate, it can only work a certain number of hours in a year, and therefore it has an actual sort of maximum physical capacity. And what I see sometimes is I've seen where the assumption of 2% per year based on historical trends is then just applied for the next 30 years or something like that in a life of mine plan. And if you look at the production rate of the machine after 30 years at 2%, it's actually greater than the physical capacity of the machine. So whilst it might be fine to apply a long-term trend, make sure that you understand what the cap is that should be on that trend, and then you actually cap it at that rate if it achieves it somewhere in your life of mine plan. Now, just finally coming back to one thing that I forgot to mention on the 1 or 2 year budget, and that built-in improvement assumptions that are used in that relative to your long-term historical rates, which I very frequently see. And one thing I would say there is that I don't believe in building in an improvement assumption into the budget unless there's actually a plan for that improvement. I frequently see at numerous mine sites that it's just a case of, no, we don't like those numbers. We don't think we should be using long-term historical numbers, because otherwise that doesn't drive an improvement mindset at our mine. We want to use better numbers. We want to drive a mentality of continuously improving. And so we're not going to use that number. We're going to use this number instead. But there should be a plan to get to that number. If your digger is currently getting 6 million cubes in a year and you're putting in 7.5 in your annual budget or your 2-year budget, what's the plan to get from the 6 to 7.5? What are the delays that are going to be reduced? Or how is the productivity going to be increased? So even in an annual budget or 2-year budget, I don't agree with just randomly choosing some improvement assumptions. There should be an initiative in place that can then also be tracked. What did we think we were going to get from that initiative, and what did we actually get from that initiative?
Thanks for listening to Mine Planning Matters and my thoughts on mine planning. This podcast is for the benefit of the mining industry, and that's you. So I'd love to hear from you through the comments section, and please feel free to let me know any topics you'd like discussed in future episodes. You'll find much more content at our Insignia mining website, and if you find any of our content valuable, please let your mining colleagues know so they can benefit as well.